Hey folks, in this episode, it's all about making photographs with Ibarionex Perello. This is TWiP. Hey, welcome back to another episode. I'm sitting here with veteran podcaster, author, photographer, and all-around cool guy with a smooth jazz voice. Mr. Ibarionex Perello is here to talk about his latest project, which is a book called Making Photographs. Hey, Ibarionex, man, how you doing?
Good, friend. Good to chat with you again. It's been too long.
Yeah, I know it's been too long. It's always good to chat with you. I always feel intimidated by that cool, sultry voice you got, man. It's not fair.
Hey, you got to keep some of your hair, so the universe is...
The universe corrects. Yeah. It self-corrects. But, you know, I'm on my way to not having any left. So, no, man, it's really good to have you on. And I was looking forward to doing this and catching up with you. I was happy you reached out about this new project you're working on with Rocky Nook Publishing and the cool cats over there. Tell us a little bit about that. So the book is called Making Photographs. And aside from the obvious, what's the book about?
Well, the whole title of the book is Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow. Mm-hmm. I wish there was a cooler subtitle, but that was about as accurate a reflection as we could make it.
Yeah.
But here was the idea behind it. It was born from, oh my God, I'm gonna have to turn that off. Can we start over? Hold on a second.
Yeah, we can start. Let me stop this.
My coffee maker.
No worries. 2, 1, go.
Well, the book is called Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow. And the idea was really born out of my experiences teaching workshops. Mm-hmm. Part of my workshops is always critiquing of the images. And time after time, I would get students out making photographs after I taught them some of the principles that I use in my own photography. And without exception, I'd always get, well, I don't think I got anything good. They always were sure that their photographs were just miserable. And time after time, I would look at photographs that were absolutely amazing. And as I started explaining what it was I was seeing in the photographs, they started getting a sense of the fact that they were capable of making really good photographs.
Yeah.
But they really didn't know how to be able to do that consistently. And more importantly, they weren't able to understand when and how they made a good photograph. And I would just see that all the time. And so what I began teaching in the workshops in terms of the critique sessions was basically a way of breaking down a scene that they can apply not only when they're making the photographs, but also when it comes time to actually critique the images. And kind of based on some principles that I included in my first book, which is called Chasing the Light, I just broke down a scene into what I call the visual draws, which is light and shadow, line and shape, color and gesture. And those are principles that I apply all the time when I'm walking the streets or traveling and making photographs. It allows me to take a scene, break it apart, and put it back together and make a composition around those ideas. But those very same concepts allow you to take a look at a photograph and basically have a systematic way of evaluating it. Not just, oh, I like the photograph and not being able to quantify why. You can take a look at a photograph and go, oh, it's the light and the shadow, or the way I'm using line and shape, or the way the color plays off another color in the frame, or the gesture of a human figure in the right half of the composition that balances everything out. Mm-hmm. So when we go out and shoot, they would apply those principles. And then when we came back and we sat down and critiqued the images, it wasn't about, oh, I like this picture. It was like, okay, no, it's not about whether you like it or not. Okay, if you're responding to the image, let's break it down. What's happening here in terms of light and shadow, line and shape, color and gesture? And that repetition allowed them to sort of cement the idea of, oh, now I understand why a photograph can and does work or doesn't work.
Yeah.
I think it's just as valuable concept to understand is to take a look at a picture, understand why it doesn't work, and then basically put that somewhere in your brain so that the next time you encounter a scene that's very similar to that, you know exactly what to do. You know the different choices to make, because the last time that you saw a scene like this, say a high contrast scene, you didn't bias the exposure for the highlights. So it gave you this overall exposure, and you blew out the highlights, and the impact of the shot was completely lost.
Yeah.
And I just felt that so much of photo education, whether it's in books, whether it's in workshops, whether it's in YouTube videos, so much of what photo education seems to me is that you get all these little bits and pieces about, okay, this is depth of field, or this is metering, or this is how you use layers in Photoshop. And people apply these bits of information sort of piecemeal. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, in the end, still feel incredibly frustrated with the fact that they've spent all this money, they spent all this time learning how to use the camera, learning how to use software, and yet they still struggle with being able to consistently make good photographs.
Yeah. Now, do you feel that or is the thrust of the book, obviously it's to help people become better photographers, but is it to help them become a better photographer at the point of capture or in the post-processing phase, or is it a circular loop where, you're going to shoot one way, I'm going to show you how you could have done it better, then you're going to rinse and repeat. Next time you go out into the field and you're going to do some street photography, you'll remember what you learned, and then eventually you'll get it right in camera. What's the best way to think about it? That's
part of it. But I think I set a real big challenge for myself, because what I'm really trying to teach people is the art of seeing, of actively seeing. I always, when I talk about making photographs, I never say taking photographs, because taking photographs to me just refers to the action of pressing the button and not really observing what's in the frame, which is how many of us start off making photographs. We respond to something, we raise the camera, we press the button, and only later when we take a look at the picture do we realize that there was a tree growing out of somebody's head, or there was a white car, that passed in the background. All these elements that were right in front of us, but that we were completely oblivious to when we were making or taking the photograph.
Yeah.
So making the photograph really sort of implies an idea of developing your own way of seeing to the point that you're aware of what you're seeing as you're observing a scene, and then consequently making a photograph.
Well, give me some tips around that, though. So if you're out and about, you're in Los Angeles and I'm in the Bay Area, so you're out on the streets of an urban location, and people are thinking back to the book. What are some things that they should keep in mind in order to see their environment differently, or see it as a photographer versus just sort of, taking the environment or taking photos?
The first thing that I emphasize in the book and in the workshops is just observe light and shadow. Mm-hmm. Take a look at what's happening with light and shadow, because that will tell you a lot about the quality and the quantity of the light that you're seeing. Mm-hmm. Like I just came... I live near Pasadena. We just came in from doing some errands, and the light was really hard, creating this strong contrast between light and shadow. Yeah. So it tells me there's an abundance of light, that the light is very hard, that the shadows can be really well defined and even deep in certain areas. And so that gives me a lot of information in terms of the kinds of shots that I can make, especially if I want to create a high contrast black and white. Mm-hmm. Leverage that light in order to be able to do that. But as well as telling me about the visual aesthetic that provides me, it gives me a lot of information directly related to the camera. It's like I got a lot of light to work with, so I can probably work with ISO, 100 or 200. I set my white balance to sunny. Yep. I can, when I'm exposing for a scene, I can decide whether or not I want to get a overall even exposure where I get detail in the highlights or the shadows, or I can purposely bias the exposure to crush the blacks in camera and emphasize the area and highlight. So that process of looking starts informing how you eventually end up making a photograph. But even better than that is when you start paying attention to light and shadow, scenes and potential subject matter pop up. Because you're no longer looking for a literal good subject. You're not looking for an interesting character walking down the street. You're not looking for, you've been through that situation where you go out, you make photographs, and you come back and you go, oh, there was nothing good to photograph.
Yeah.
It's like, no, there was plenty good to photograph. The problem was you weren't seeing in a way that it revealed it to you.
Yeah.
By breaking it down and taking that step back and not saying, oh, I need a particular subject matter to leap out at me in order for me to make a photograph. By simply observing what's happening with light and shadow, for example, there's an assortment of subject matter that all of a sudden gets presented to you. And frequently, it's subject matter that you might never have considered before. You'll just see the play of light and shadow against a building that has a little bit of red, and there's a yellow fire hydrant there, and the shadow cuts across the two of them, and you realize, wow, that is remarkable, not only in terms of the light and shadow, but also in terms of the color and the textures and the shapes. And it takes a scene that's incredibly mundane and ordinary, and simply because of the way you are preserving it and make the photographs, it becomes something extraordinary.
Yeah. You see, that's fantastic. And as I listen to you talk through this, it brings up a bunch of questions, and I jotted a couple of them down. And one of them is, and I know the answer to this, but I want you to articulate it. So is what you're talking about hardware agnostic? In other words, if you're talking about, seeing light and shadow, does it matter what I'm using to capture that light and shadow with, whether it be, an Android or iOS device all the way up to the best mirrorless or DSLR?
In terms of seeing, it doesn't make any difference in terms of the camera, because the seeing can happen whether or not you have a camera with you or not.
Yeah.
The choice of the camera informs how you can render that scene in a photograph. With a smartphone, you're dealing with a wide-angle lens that has a fairly wide dynamic range. It may or may not give you the capability of being able to bias the exposure and have the level of control that you have with, say, a mirrorless camera or a DSLR. Mm-hmm. If you are using a more sophisticated camera, then you have a lot more choices that you can make. Mm-hmm. In terms of how you compose for the scene, how you expose for it, whether you shoot it in black and white or in color, whether you use a high ISO or a low ISO, the choice of lenses, which allows you to either open up and include more content in the frame or exclude it by using a telephoto and more narrowly composing the scene. So it just is a matter of you take what you've seen, what you've observed, what you're responding to, how you actually understand why that scene may or may not work. And then depending on the equipment that you have, it makes the choices either less or more, right? If you're using a smartphone, there's an advantage to that in that all you have is that lens and that phone and whatever number of controls it has available to you. So actually that is more conducive to seeing, responding, and making a photograph to an extent that isn't as easy with a DSLR, particularly if you're not completely confident or familiar with the device.
Right.
So you just put it up to the scene, and you get to emphasize composition more so than anything else.
Yeah.
But once you get into a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, then at that point you have a lot more variables. So the more adept you are in understanding all those key controls, the quicker you can get to what you experience with a smartphone.
Well, and that begs another question, on that same tangent with the smartphone. Some people will say, well, you know what? Why do I need to care about understanding all this stuff, or f-stops and shutter speeds and ISO or composition? Well, composition, obviously, but why do I need to understand this stuff? Because computational photography and artificial intelligence and all these things that they're grafting into these smartphone supercomputers that we have, which will probably make their ways into mirrorless cameras. Do I need to care about that stuff? Is that stuff like, rubbing sticks together versus using a Bic lighter? What do you say to those folks?
I think there are a lot of people for whom the smartphone is more than enough camera for them, because it does everything that they need it to do in order for them to capture the photographs. And with all the different apps that are available, even the different lens modifiers they can put on top of the phone, for a lot of people, that's all they need. They don't want or need to complicate it any more than that. But there are some photographers that are going to find that the camera phone limits them in a way that they find frustrating or that doesn't express what they're trying to convey in their photographs. And it's then that upgrading to quote unquote real camera makes sense.
Yeah, and use and that was a leading question, but of course. But what about post, right? So in the book, do you, we're talking a lot about sort of pre-visualization, visualization, and understanding the light and shadow interplays in a scene, that sort of thing. But what about in post-processing? Do you factor that in to the overall story that is the photograph? Because the shadows could be crushed and you didn't intend them to be, but if you shot in RAW, you could probably pull something out of that. How does that play into what you're teaching?
It becomes absolutely essential to understanding that, because even though I shoot RAW, I will still expose my scene as if I'm shooting a JPEG. It's because when I pull up that image on Lightroom or Exposure X or whatever software that I'm using, what I see in front of me is pretty close to my vision for the shot. But then I still use those ideas of light and shadow, line and shape, color and gesture to start shaping the image. Because what I get out of the camera, regardless of how sophisticated or advanced that camera is, that's only a starting point.
Yeah.
But when I look at the shot that I've chosen out of that 7 or 12 or 14 that I made out of that scene, I'm evaluating the shot based on those ideas, those visual draws, to narrow it down to that one photograph. And once I have that one photograph, at that point, I start making my global adjustments in order to get, establish my black point, white point, adjust contrast, pre-sharpening, all of that. And then I start making much more selective edits. But I'm paying attention to, when I made this shot, there was this area in the background that was a little brighter than my subject. So I have to make sure that I have to use dodge and burning techniques to de-emphasize that area in the background so that the focus still remains where I want it on my subject, or the way the lines and shapes, I'm using them in the frame. I may see that, I need to just crop this a little tighter in order for the relationship between all those lines and shapes to play off of each other in a better way. Or I may find that, the colors, though they may play off of each other really nicely, that there's a red or a yellow that's a little bit too oversaturated and imbalances the shot in that way. So all of those things that I was aware of when I was making the composition further refines my process when I'm post-processing. So rather than using some other photographer's presets and just slapping that on top of my photograph and thinking that I'm done, I'm making really conscious, informed decisions in terms of how I felt when I made the shot and trying to get as close to that when I create the final photograph, so that when someone sees it, be it on screen or in a print, they'll experience that moment in the same way that I did. And it's as a result of knowing that all of these qualities inform and control how anyone experiences a photograph. Yeah. So knowing that helps me to make really precise choices in terms of how I'm composing and when I'm making the shot, and then how I'm post-processing it when it's in front of me on my computer.
I love that. And it sounds like, an analogy might be you are composing the music. You had the idea for the song, you're composing the music, and then the post-processing phase is sort of the performance of that music. You know, you're bringing it all together to the vision that you had when you captured the image. May not be exactly what you wrote down on the paper, but when you perform it, that's the idea that you wanted to get across there. Is that a
No,
good
you know,
analogy?
Ansel Adams said that. He's like I forget what exactly his phrase is, but he said the prince is the performance.
There you go. Maybe that's where I heard it from. Yeah, very cool.
But it's really true because, you know, so much of what happens in education with respect to software, especially Photoshop and with Lightroom or any other application, is that you're always learning these techniques, right? You're learning how to sharpen this. You're learning how to convert over sort of black and white. And a lot of that is about the technique to achieve a certain look, but it's not so much about the intent behind it. So a lot of people will see some other photographer, especially on Instagram, they'll see, wow, that really looks cool. How can I do that? And there are YouTube channels that are dedicated exclusively to walking people through how to get that look.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's, you know, a duotone, whether it's a high contrast black and white. And so people want to learn to get that technique in order to get that look. What's missing from that is that the original photographer came up with that approach or that technique or that sensibility in terms of the post-processing because they had a vision for their work, because they had a specific vision for, if not an individual photograph, a series of photographs. What happens is other people learn that technique, they mimic it, and it just seems like a poor man's version of whatever photographer they're emulating.
The original. Yeah. It's a bad copy, right?
Who's that photographer? I forget his name. He does all the compositing. He taught on, and I interviewed him for the show, and I'm drawing for a blank. I apologize for that. But he's really famous for doing these composites where he'll photograph someone, and then he'll lay them against some sort of background. And it's sort of this HDR. He does these HDR backgrounds, and they don't.
Yeah, sure.
I forget his name, but I saw when he first started coming out and getting big, and he started teaching classes out at Kilby, I saw all these people, you know, mirroring and taking off his technique, and you could really tell the difference between his work and everyone else. And that's not to say that learning in that way is a bad thing. I don't think it is, because it's valuable in terms of learning different processes that you can apply. The mistake is stopping at that point where you figured out how to do it, and then it ends there. It's like, no, okay, you learn that technique. How do you make it your own?
Yeah.
That has to be tied into vision. And so the whole idea that I'm trying to suggest in the book, and why it says developing a personal visual workflow, is that everything that I'm teaching you in the book is tied to the unique way you see and experience the world. Because if I'm going out with a bunch of different photographers and we all have the same camera, and I teach them the same principles in terms of light and shadow, every time I have a workshop, my students take pictures and I go, damn, that's good. Yeah. I didn't see that. I was right there with you, walking that same street, same time of day, and I didn't see that in the way that you did. And that's the best thing about photography, but also in terms of being a teacher. Just by giving people just a little bit of information, they get to discover their own special way of seeing the world. And when they succeed in translating that into effective photograph, there's nothing more gratifying. Yeah. So I knew that when I wrote this book, that I wanted to translate that experience that I have in person into a book, just so I could reach out to more people, and that they themselves would be able to get that satisfaction of finally discovering the beginnings of their own voice and being able to be less frustrated with something that is supposed to bring us so much joy.
Yeah. It's powerful. And again, I would suggest people check the book out, because you've poured a lot of you into the book, and you know, it's very powerful. So I want to switch gears a little bit. And while I have you here, you're world-class street photographer in general. You know your stuff. You teach your stuff to other people. there's a question that pops up on This Week in Photo from time to time about street photography versus photojournalism, and what's the line between the two. So now that I have you here, a real live street photographer, I'm hoping you can help demystify that. What is the difference between street photography and photojournalism? Is it a plane ticket or is it something more?
You mean Valerie didn't answer this question for you already?
She tried. She couldn't answer it.
Okay, what's the difference? It's a difficult question to answer because there's no singular way of being able to look at it. It's really about intent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Photojournalism is primarily about storytelling.
Yep.
It's about using either a singular photograph or a series of photographs to express a narrative about an event, or a person, or a group of people. And what you're doing is you're trying to tell a story using usually nothing more than the photographs. That's not always the case, but that's the intent behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about really sort of communicating more than just a visual aesthetic. It's more than just producing a nice, composed and beautiful photograph, though that can be part and parcel of it. Street photography is more, well, in general, street photography is less about the narrative. Sometimes it can be. It's more, if it isn't about narrative, it's more about the narrative of a particular moment in time that is not necessarily informing the viewer in terms of the context of that story. Like if you see a couple embracing in the street, and there's this lovely play of light and shadow, there's a lot that you don't know about those people. You don't know names. You may not even recognize the city that they're in. You may have to be able to gauge their general age, whether they're older, whether they're younger, whether they're gay or straight or whatever it is. You just kind of read the photograph and then you just kind of look at the aesthetics of it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there's left to the imagination in such a shot, in such a shot that isn't applicable to photojournalism. It's the antithesis of that.
Right.
And then documentary is sort of like a hybrid of the two. In documentary, you're more trying to tell a larger story, mm-hmm. usually through a series of images. But there, the characters, for lack of a better word, are more important than they usually are in a street photograph, because there, oftentimes the people are either used as a graphic element or as a counterpoint to the light or the environment. But the aesthetics in terms of what makes a good street photograph in terms of light, shadow composition, I think are applied to a greater degree than they sometimes are in photojournalism. Because in photojournalism, not all the images are aesthetically pleasing, mm-hmm. because it's leaning more on sort of telling the story.
Yeah.
They can be a little messier, though there are plenty of photojournalists who are amazing photographers visually, and they're able to sort of mash all three of these genres into their work.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say that there's a cookie cutter, form or shape to any of these.
Yeah.
Principles and approaches to each sort of bleed into the other.
It's a gradient, right?
Yeah, so it really comes down to what your intent is with your photographs ultimately. I mean, the great majority of stuff that I do is street photographs, but whenever I'm doing documentary work for nonprofits, I'm taking my street sensibility in there, because I'm being thrown into a situation where the people are aware that I'm there. They're doing whatever that they're doing. I understand that I'm trying to convey something about the activity and the relationships and the work that these people do. But I'm thinking in terms of a street photograph, about, okay, I see something and I only have seconds to react in order to not only convey the importance of this moment, but for me to create a composition that really works and that is very pleasing to me as a singular photograph.
I love that. Very good. See, this is why I like talking to you, man, because it's like I feel like I'm learning. I'm learning. I realize how much I don't know when I talk to you. So what? So the book. Let's bring it full circle back to the book, where it's available now digitally, right? And why don't you tell me, where is it available now, and where is it going to be available later?
You're right. The book, the soft cover, comes out December. I think the second week in December, like December 10th or 11th. But people can place an order now, and if you want to receive the ebook, you can get the ebook today. And it will be downloaded in a variety, I think a PDF, or I forget exactly what the format is, but I think it's PDF. So you can view it on your computer, your tablet, your phone. And then you can also pre-order the soft cover, which comes out in, as I said, in December, or you can get both. So you can go back and forth between the soft cover and the ebook.
Yep.
And if you go to the Rocky Nook website and purchase it there, and you use the code Perello 40, that's P as in Paul, ERELLO 40, you get 40% off the list price of the book.
Perfect.
In what form you decide to get it. So, which is an incredible deal.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a 300-page book, and the person who designed and laid out the book was just remarkable. I mean, I looked at it and I go, wow, they made me look like I actually knew what I was talking about.
No, and while you've been talking, I've been sort of showing a preview of what some of the pages inside the book look like. And you're right, it was very well laid out, and it's very well done. So kudos to Rocky Nook Publishing. But Rocky Nook always does a great job. They are, I've told those guys they're like the Apple of the publishing industry. Although I don't know if that's a compliment these days or not, but they do a really good job, and they have a very high level of attention to detail over at Rocky Nook. So very cool, man. So I'll point people to all this stuff in the blog post for this interview, as well as in the YouTube video. Any parting thoughts you'd like to leave with the audience about, making photographs or seeing light and shadow or any of that stuff?
The book is really and the way the structure of the book is that each chapter is starts off with an image that I made and the story behind it. So I not only talk about the technical choices I made, but I'm talking about the mindset, about how I came upon a scene and how I evaluated it. And that for me was an important part of my choice with respect to writing the book, because I wanted to emphasize that this process of seeing is a really personal one, and you never graduate. What happens is that you slowly, and sometimes painfully slowly, evolve your way of seeing and making photographs. But as you learn and as you practice and you learn how to assess, evaluate, critique your own work, that's when the fun really begins, because you don't rely on someone else telling you, oh, you're talented or that's a good photograph. You have an understanding of what you're doing. And that experience is the thing that brings me the most satisfaction and joy about my own photography. I like making a good picture, but sometimes the biggest joy for me is from recognizing a scene or a scene's potential that I would not have had even picked up on 6 months or a year before.
Yeah. That
tells me I'm growing, I'm improving. So it's my hope that anyone who picks up this book and reads it and applies the principles and does and tries all the exercises, that they discover that for themselves. And if I've done that, then I feel like it's successful.
Love it. Well, thank you for coming on, man. I appreciate it. So those were perfect parting thoughts, but I also want to give a plug to your podcast. So you've got one of the longest running podcasts on photography out there. It's fantastic. Give us the Candid Frame elevator pitch.
The Candid Frame, it's an interview show where I feature conversations with photographers about their work and career. It's less about equipment, and it's not an equipment review show. It's about how photographers make photography part of their lives, whether they're a seasoned professional or whether they're a dentist who does it just for the sheer pleasure of it. And if you're someone who really enjoys learning about how other people make photography a part of their lives, then listen to this show. It's been going on for almost 13 years now. We're going to be hitting 500 interviews in 2019. And I think it's a great resource, and people can either listen to it on iTunes or Spotify. But the best way is to download the free Candid Frame app, which is available for both Android and Apple iOS. And people can go to the Candid Frame website, thecandidframe.com, and download it, because there you'll get access to every episode that we've ever recorded. And the entire listing is not available on iTunes, because iTunes does a cutoff at some point. I forget whether it's 300 or something.
Yeah, I think it is like 250 or 300. Yeah.
So if you enjoy the show and you want to listen to everything, which some people tell me they do remarkably.
Yeah.
Lots of hours of content, but download the app and just enjoy.
Awesome. All right. Well, once again, thanks for coming on, Ibarionex. I appreciate it. Ibarionex Perello, you are a photographer, you are an educator, and you are a podcaster. So 3 legs of your tripod. So congratulations.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, man. Take care. This is TWiP.